Time flies and over a year has gone by since I made my very first Azur Lane presentation, posted as "You Are Not Immune to Salem Propaganda," and titled "Make Heavy Cruisers Great Again." To celebrate, I wanted to bring us back full circle and really consolidate all the events and developments that have occurred since, though naturally through the lens of Salem's prospects and potential. On today's agenda, we have the ever-changing landscape of Azur Lane, a task failed successfully, gameplay design in a niche to fill, and character design in low-hanging fruit. Stagnation kills mobile games. I don't think this should be really all that surprising. Azur Lane is a mobile game that is free to download and relies entirely on microtransactions to bring in revenue as far as the app alone is concerned. If people get bored and stop playing, well, there goes your revenue. Thankfully, the people behind Azur Lane, whether that be Manju, Yostar, or Yongsu, are not exactly blind to this. We've had many things added to the game, even fairly recently. For some examples, we've had the CV detection gauge, the augment system, and Project TB added. For gameplay balance, we've had the destroyer maximum break bonuses, the light cruiser gun damage buff, and obviously the good old way to stave off stagnation is some old-fashioned power creep. And then some visual improvements, so the UI changing twice now since the game started, and visual enhancement. Let's just say Alsace on the right here being here is very intentional. That being said, aside from the few things that they've already teased, what comes next is pretty much a mystery to all of us looking in from the outside. So what do I mean by a task failed successfully? Well, they only read the title. They didn't even read the subtitle. Just the title. A mere 3 weeks after I made my presentation and posted it to the internet, PR6 comes out and we get Hindenburg. That's not Salem. 2 months later, JP anniversary rolls around and guess what we get? Unsen, who is also not Salem. 3 is a crowd, 4 is a party. Also, the artwork power creep is real. Just look at Drake. She's cool, don't get me wrong, but just look at Hindenburg and Unsen in comparison. Hindenburg's got her own entire background going on there, and Unsen, of course, has her very prominent butterfly theming going on. Also, the addition of Knopfler has slightly ruined this joke, but it still stands that the Eagle Union is the only major faction without a Rainbow Heavy Cruiser now. So, now that we've established that the Eagle Union is clearly in need of an ultra-rare heavy cruiser, let's talk about why Salem is the right girl for that job. Some might argue that Salem is somehow too new, but we have plenty of ships that were laid down during the war, but only commissioned into their respective navies afterwards. Jean Bar's story is complicated, to put it mildly, so we won't get into the details of that here, but notice that Salem isn't even all that out of place in this club, being commissioned into the fleet in the same year as Jean Bar, and an entire year before the Chapayev-class cruisers would make it into service themselves. As the last heavy cruisers designed and built for the U.S. Navy, the Des Moines are the culmination of U.S. gun cruiser design. Though only sporting 9 8-inch guns, the same as all U.S. heavy cruisers following the Pensacola's, the automated loading and firing mechanisms installed allowed the 8-inch 55 caliber rapid-fire Mark 16 guns to achieve rates of fire often in excess of double that of conventionally loaded contemporary 8-inch guns, such as the preceding Mark 15 and the 8-inch guns fielded by other navies around the world. While not a great deal more protected than the preceding Baltimore and Oregon City classes in terms of armor thicknesses, their sheer size at 21,800 tons fully loaded, and the redundancy built into these ships ensure that they were the most survivable heavy cruisers the U.S. had ever built. The class were among the first in the United States to replace the ubiquitous quad 40mm mounts with the 3-inch 50 caliber mounts built for much greater stopping power and lethality against contemporary aerial threats. They also featured the typical American pyramidal superstructure of the period, intended to clear arcs of fire for the AA guns as much as possible. Fire control for the main battery had also advanced so much that the 8-inch guns could be tasked against airborne threats, provided the guns could elevate high enough to intercept the threat, adding time-fused 8-inch high-capacity round to the list of unpleasant ways to die if attempting to threaten a Des Moines-class cruiser in an aircraft. USS Newport News became the U.S. Navy's first fully air-conditioned ship and the last serving all-gun ship after over 25 years of service, helping to prove the class's potential for longevity had the need arisen. So when it comes to adding Salem into Azur Lane, for survivability stats, I'm kind of looking at 6,000 HP, medium armor, around 80 evasion, 26 speed, and these put all together should put her roughly in line with Drake and Hindenburg from a pure base stat perspective. 300-ish firepower, the same as all the other Rainbow Heavy Cruisers, and 190 reloads similar to Unzen should round out her offensive stats. 400 AA will put her roughly on par with Cheshire, with still a decent gap away from Guam. And with 150 accuracy, like the other Rainbow Heavy Cruisers, that should just about do it. Ironically, one of the biggest obstacles, in my opinion, to Salem being added to Azur Lane is her greatest asset, the 8-inch Mark 16 gun. It's just way too strong compared to practically every 8-inch gun that came before it, American or otherwise. No, it's not the biggest shell out there. No, it doesn't have amazing muzzle velocity. What it does have, like the Mark 15 guns that came before it, are super heavy 8-inch shells, and for the Mark 16 specifically, a blazing fast reload. Let's compare to Hindenburg for a second here. 12 guns with ideally a 12-second reload. Provided the crew can keep that up, that's 60 rounds a minute. Salem's 9 guns reload in 6 seconds, that's 90 rounds per minute. Additionally, since a significant portion of the firing cycle is automated, crew fatigue is less of a factor in maintaining the 6-second firing cycle. Thus, adding Salem, and naturally this gun to Azur Lane, will have to be a balancing act. We want to see the gun's historical performance being manifested to an acceptable degree. We'd like this gun to not thoroughly demolish the competition posed by the other Rainbow Heavy Cruiser guns, and we also want to make sure that this gun is actually reasonably viable on any ship that can equip heavy cruiser guns, not just Salem and her sisters. What happens when you don't care about balance relative to the other Rainbow Heavy Cruiser guns? Let's start with the same super heavy shells as the Mark 15 super heavy shell. So that's 51 base damage with 75, 110, and 85 mods. Let's give it a typical Rainbow coefficient of 136%, and then only touch the reload, since that's the only real thing that changed when the US Navy moved from the Mark 15 guns to the Mark 16 guns, as far as their performance is concerned. The German 8-inch guns in question are the 20.3cm 60 caliber SKC-34. The Hindenburg gun simply puts 3 of these into a single turret, rather than the 2 per turret found on the Hippers. Their rate of fire is given as 4 to 5 rounds per minute per gun, of course. So let's cut the base reload in half compared to the Hindi gun, assuming the more optimistic 5 rounds per minute to match the 10 rounds per minute that the Mark 16 achieves. This gives us a 3.66 second base reload. Plug that into our handy DPS equation that I've already filled out for us, and that gives us a light DPS of 69.93, or 3% better than the Unzen gun, a medium DPS of 102.64, or 61% better than the Hindi gun, and a heavy DPS of 79.31. So that's 56% better than the Guam gun and 66% better than the Drake gun. Something tells me this is slightly too strong. If we do try to balance these against the medium DPS of the Hindi gun, the Mark 16 will have slightly worse light DPS, but significantly better heavy DPS. With the same stats and all that jazz as the Mark 15 super heavy shell and a rainbow coefficient, we're going to catch up via reload speed only. This gives us a base reload of about 6.36 seconds, and assuming this exact reload, provided the devs don't decide to change this in some other way, a light DPS of 43.59, so slightly better than the purple IJN Type 3 No. 2 gun, a medium DPS of 63.94, so marginally better than the Hindi gun. It's 0.03 of a point of damage per second over the Hindi gun, and a heavy DPS of 49.4, so that's 3% better than the Drake gun, but still 3% worse than the Guam gun. They should result in a reasonably strong Rainbow Heavy Cruiser gun. Does this perfectly match historical performance? No, not really. But if we were trying to go for historical performance across the board all the time, we would have never gotten the Hindi gun in the first place, since it's identical to the rune gun that we've had since PR1 in all but rarity. And finally, some genuine serious ideas probably. We could give Salem a main gun reload time cut when she's using USS gear, perhaps a special AA gun when she's using the Mark 16. This would be tied to her, not the gun, since it's the fire control systems that were introduced with the Des Moines class cruisers that allowed them to use their 8-inch guns in the dual purpose role. 6 shots for an all-out assault, and then a separate barrage tied to her main gun firing, and maybe some technomancer wizardry stuff. We'll get there, that's more of a character design thing. So, broad strokes, I'm not saying that Salem needs to show up with a main gun mount 3, but she should at least feel like she has main gun mount 3. How one might go about accomplishing this may vary, like perhaps she stays on main gun mount 2, but she gets a barrage that fires whenever her main guns fire in return. The AA gun mount 2 is something I'd be willing to let go of. Guam gets AA gun mount 2, and that makes sense because she's definitely packing a lot of barrels onto the scene. The Alaskas had 14 quad bofors to Salem's 12 3-inch mounts, and 34 Oerlikons to Salem's 12. So the medium AA bracket performance is kind of similar. You could argue slightly in favor of Salem, thanks to the longer reach and stopping power of the 3-inch, but she's unquestionably beat in the short-range AA department. I want Salem's AA to be good enough to hold her own, but she doesn't need to be an AA carry in her own right. If she's given main gun mount 3, then the raw heavy cruiser gun DPS should roughly match Hindi, and her overall effective DPS should be 10 to 15% higher than what Hindi provides. When I say effective DPS, I mean her presence in your fleet should result in the damage you deal being increased by an amount equal to 10 to 15% more than what Hindi being in your fleet would provide. The concept is kind of similar to the niche that Vanguard currently fills. Vanguard's own DPS is relatively lackluster compared to the other Rainbow battleships, but her presence allows your other battleships to do that much more damage. Thus, her contribution to the fight has to also include how much extra damage your other BBs did, thanks to her support. Part of the reason why I'm okay with Salem's own DPS being slightly less than what Hindi can provide is because I want her to be tanky enough to survive in high-end content as an off-tank. In this way, Napoli is the ridiculously tanky one, Hindi is the kind of risky option that allows you to pull out a lot of DPS, Unzen's DPS is stacked in torpedoes and is just about tanky enough to sit in off-tank, and Salem nearly matches Hindi's DPS, but in exchange can comfortably sit in the off-tank position without you worrying about it. Another thing to keep in mind is as I write this, Hindi does not yet have her Fate Sim 5 yet, so it remains to be seen how much of a buff she gets when that drops. And finally, of course, the usual cross-fleet barrage, and maybe also some cross-fleet buffs. Onwards to our low-hanging fruit. Halford is what I would call a step in the right direction. So, why? I want 3 themes to feature in Salem's design, and Halford draws some nice parallels, as we'll see as I proceed. Halford comes with an impressive fusion of the classic Union sci-fi, magical elements, and her totally not a vampire aesthetic. Hexagons also feature prominently in the background art for her. And the bear stand is somewhat reminiscent of Morrison, just now adjusted to showcase the 5-inch more directly and match Halford's general theme. Finally, we get to the 3 pillars around which to build Salem's character and design around. Sci-fi and mecha, in consideration of the Eagle Union's general shift towards mecha and mecha-inspired breaking elements, which, in reference to her moniker and service, and the city of Salem and its history, and magical girls, my personal preference, but I do think it makes a lot of sense. Hello and welcome to the Eagle Union, where all of our newest ship girls either have full-blown mecha or mecha-inspired elements in their riggings. Obviously, it's not 100% consistent, but a majority is a majority. Salem doesn't need a full-blown mecha. She should at least incorporate some elements, though. As for 2 recent designs that aren't full-blown mecha that I do really enjoy, and the 2 that come to mind are Houston 2 and Constellation. So maybe drawing some amount of inspiration from there would be nice. Next up, we've got Witch, because it's the right thing to do. Salem without any witch references or theming is probably a violation of the Geneva Convention. Give her a hat. Throw her some ropes. You give her a cat. Let the cat hold some elements of her rigging. There's not exactly a lot of Azur Lane examples to draw from, though. Vishen and Leon are the only base skins, and even then Leon is aiming for more of a battle mage look than she is a witch. We also have 6 Halloween skins that you could possibly take some notes from. Now, you could stop right there and say that you've done Salem justice. But here's where the lowest hanging fruit imaginable comes in. Just make it a Halloween skin. You gotta toss out the mecha even if you want and focus 100% on the witch costume. It just works. And last, and most definitely not least, magical girls! It's the glue that brings it all together. Love, peace, friendship, and really big explosions. Like seriously though, have you seen how much collateral damage magical girls inflict when they fight? I'm just here trying to harness that energy for more productive means. No, I'm not advocating for lolly. Just because it's a magical role doesn't mean it has to be a lolly. Just look at Vanguard. In terms of body proportions, I think we can just look at Northampton 2 and the Baltimores and go off of there. And then the cat idea, that's literally a perfect magical girl pet. Give her a name, take her everywhere and put her in every skin, and you're golden. Then we can give her a magical girl staff, incorporating some elements of her superstructure, like perhaps her air search and surface search radars. A star or moon-shaped magical jewel. With a star you could tie like the sailor uniform ribbon together nicer, just as a centerpiece on that. A crescent moon shape can do the same if you want, but it's probably easier to pull that off elsewhere, like on the staff itself, or as a headband, or a circlet, or a hairband, or just as a generic hair ornament sitting in her hair. And then finally, I've got a couple more just loose ideas. I've her turrets, whether that be main battery, secondary battery, or both, floating on magical circles. Use predominantly beam attacks for her barrages, because magical girls and beam attacks go hand in hand. And finally, the most unhinged of all these loose ideas probably would be Gilgamesh-style portals for the main battery and AA guns. Look, Salem, the one thing she is not lacking in reload. If she wants to go out there, just fire her guns through a bunch of portals and just spam bullets and shells and all that goodness everywhere, that's her business. Let her do it. The road to getting USS Salem in Azur Lane as an ultra-rare heavy cruiser may be a rather long one. It could also, just as well, be quite a short one. Either way, you can be sure that I'll be here the whole way, memeing and praying for Salem to finally find her way home. For the longest time, heavy cruisers have felt like the least rewarding class of ships to use. Their long reload times, combined with their inability to quickly break bullet shields, has meant that Shikans across the globe could only watch in despair as their long-awaited heavy cruiser gunfire simply broke itself upon the shields of the baddies, leaving their hearts empty as the baddies sailed along without so much as a scratch. We have made great strides in alleviating this problem in the last year, with Hindenburg able to bypass shields, and Unzen relying on torpedoes to put warheads on foreheads. Napoli can also bypass shields under the right circumstances. But the work isn't done yet. We turn to the Eagle Union, who has yet to debut their own Rainbow Heavy Cruiser. Thus, I must implore those of you at home, we must fight for the just enfranchisement of Salem enjoyers by giving them a permanent representative in Azur Lane. Salem would bring about the gloriousness of the Union's finest technology married to the omnipotence of a magical girl. Without Salem, there is no permanent solution to the inadequacies of the heavy cruisers we have on hand. So as the end of our time together draws near, I must ask everyone involved to carefully weigh their choices. Each and every day, our developers are menaced by terrible threats of Salem being reactivated, sailed to the mouth of the Yangtze River, and turning her guns to shell their offices. The only way to permanently end this unrest is to placate the extremist Salem enjoyers by adding her to Azur Lane. Only then will Salem enjoyers truly be free. Only then will the Azur Lane community reach enlightenment and ascend to heights none have laid eyes upon. Salem will set us free. Thank you everyone for seeing this through to the end. I look forward to seeing you all some other time. God bless Azur Lane, and may God protect our ski guns.